The principle is if you don't use it, you may very well lose it. Now, when it comes to your voice, I don't think you're going to lose your voice entirely, but you may lose some important components of your speaking ability. You may lose the ability, or maybe never had it, to speak forcefully, to speak coherently, to speak distinctly, but still we need to use our voices. The reason I say that is because people with Asperger's syndrome, Aspies or Aspergians, tend to have challenges when it comes to speaking. Our voices are often weak. We cannot project effectively, and as we'll see in a moment, that becomes cyclical. We don't speak, therefore we don't develop our voices. Because we don't have strong voices, we opt not to speak. So it goes in a cycle. Again, we'll dig down a little bit deeper in just a moment, but let's begin by drilling down by saying this, that speaking difficulty is a component of a larger trait of Asperger's syndrome, and that larger trait is communication. Communication, in turn, is a component of socializing challenges. We don't like to socialize, therefore we don't communicate. Because we don't communicate, I'm saying it backwards, because we don't communicate, we have weak voices. Now again, there are some exceptions to this. In fact, well, we'll talk about that in just a moment, but it's really simple to people who are typical. You open your mouth, you talk. I mean, how hard is that? Everybody does it, and when we don't do it, when we are, that is, we being Aspergians, when we don't do it, we are sometimes misunderstood as being arrogant. Our reticence to speak out or to communicate or to join in the conversation is often misinterpreted as being self-centered and aloof. They don't understand. Typicals don't understand. The very first presentation we dealt with this, so let me mention it very briefly, but there is a good way to help people understand what you are experiencing as an Aspergian when you find socializing very difficult. Ask your typical friends, if you can speak to them at all, well, send them an email, but ask your typical friends what it's like for them to give a speech before a large crowd of people. Now, if they're accustomed to doing that, it's no problem, but the overwhelming majority of typical people do not like to give speeches because when they give a speech, it affects their brains. They can't think clearly. They become nervous. They can't project right. They don't talk the way normal people talk when they're on the podium or behind a pulpit or whatever it happens to be, a lectern, and they look at this massive crowd of people. Oh, it's challenging to them. They have this fear factor that overwhelms them. Well, that's what people with Asperger's syndrome experience all the time, every time we encounter another individual. So if you are trying to communicate to your typical friends what it's like to have Asperger's syndrome and be reticent, to assure them you're not aloof and arrogant, just tell them, remember when you were, or ask them, remember when you were a kid and you were called upon in school to give an oral report? Remember how you felt? Most of the time, they will be horrified at the very thought. Some people even have nightmares about that experience. So it's important for us to note, I'm changing topics here, but it's important for us to note that there are some Aspies who are just the opposite. They're not quiet, they're not shy, they are actually conversant, overly conversant. That is to say, they talk too much. The term is loquacious, or in the vernacular, they're just kind of gabby. So, what are some of the traits associated with Aspergian speech challenges? The first thing we have is voice modulation. I've mentioned this in another presentation, but it fits here, so I'll bring it up again. When I was in first grade, we were taught to read. Now, back in the 50s, we had these books called Dick and Jane. See Dick run, see Jane run. We read that, and sometimes the teacher would call on us would sit in a semicircle, and she would call upon us to read out loud. One of my report cards sent home by my teacher said something to the effect that little Kenny does not speak with expression. He does not read with expression. So even back then, this indicator, voice modulation, which is the first of, I think, 4 that we have here, voice modulation, was evident. It was very obvious, at least to my teacher. And that's why they had us read out loud, so they could see how we were doing, how we were learning. And what she discovered from me was that I had what was later diagnosed as presenting myself in a flat tone. Now, when I make videos, I try to overcome that. I try to intentionally, purposely modulate my voice, but it doesn't come naturally. And even then, when I go back and watch my own videos, I'm amazed at the lack of modulation in my speaking. But so it goes. But the point being, that is one of the challenges that we have with speaking, voice modulation. And it's not just expression, it's also volume. Sometimes people with Asperger's syndrome will speak too loud, and they don't even know it. Relative to how everybody else is speaking in the social spectrum that surrounds us, we're too loud. More often, at least in my case, we're too quiet. But yeah, I've got to admit, there have been times in church, there have been times in the library, there have been times in school, those rare times when I actually spoke, I overly projected. I was just too loud. Number 1 is voice modulation, and number 2 is what I call word tripping. We talked about this in another presentation, but word tripping can be understood as this. Imagine that you are running down a hill and gravity begins to pull on you faster than your feet will carry you. So what happens is you tumble forward, and instead of running down the hill, you are now rolling down the hill. That's what happens with what I call word tripping. Word tripping goes something like this. Your brain is thinking thoughts, and you desire to express those thoughts in words. The problem is your thoughts are moving faster than your words will carry them, then your feet will carry them. So your thoughts, in a sense, are being pulled, by way of analogy, by gravity. And what comes out is something called garbled speaking. Now, I do this all the time. In fact, I have caught myself. I don't know if you caught it or not, but I've been talking for what? Maybe 8 minutes. Hard to believe I've been talking that long, but if you go back and listen to what I've said the last 8 minutes, you will notice on several occasions I tripped over my words. Now, some people may say, well, if you do that, why don't you stop your presentation and start over? The reason I don't do that is because I would never get done. Because whenever I speak, I always have a problem with word tripping. Now, I'm nearly 70 years old and I'm still facing this challenge. But believe it or not, I'm actually getting better at it. So why do we trip over our words? Well, there are some theories that have been postulated, and one theory is that because we don't speak often, we simply don't have the practice that other typical people have. They have begun practicing from the day they were born. As soon as they heard audible sounds and they tried to mimic them, their brains created the sound, their brains created the thought, and then they voiced what they heard. So they have practice from day one. Whereas people with Asperger's syndrome, not always. Sometimes we have very, very little practice. So we're not accustomed to it. And it doesn't matter how old you get, once your mind is set, in word tripping, you are always facing that challenge. Now, that's not to say that you can't overcome the challenge, because I have overcome it probably 98, 99%. Now, I want to share with you some of the tricks I used, some of the, call them hacks, that I used to overcome word tripping. So maybe you can use some of those too. Word tripping is frustrating. I experience it all the time. I've learned to control it by consciously speaking slowly and distinctly. This causes problems of its own. Easy, easy, easy to understand how this can be a problem. Just walk up to anybody and begin speaking slowly and distinctly. They will look like you're nuts. But you know what? They think I'm nuts anyhow, so I would rather be a nut who is understood than a nut who is misunderstood. Here's a good example. I was in the direct marketing business, 30-some years, so I spent a lot of time at the post office. I recall one time I was talking to the clerk behind the counter at the post office, and to make sure that she understood me, because my voice typically is very quiet, it's very hushed. I speak in very soft tones because I don't have a strong voice. So to make sure that she understood me, and when this is your livelihood, when your livelihood depends on that person behind the counter understanding you, I made sure that I spoke distinctly and clearly. Did you catch it? I just tripped over my words just a second ago. But back to what I was saying. I talked to the clerk very clearly, very distinctly. And she responded by mimicking me. She was mocking me. She responded by speaking to me very clearly and very distinctly. Now, why did she do that? I don't know, but it was kind of obvious she was making fun of me. And I think the reason may be she took offense. Because when you speak to somebody very distinctly and slowly and clearly, it's almost as if you are patronizing them, or maybe you're talking down to them the way that you talk to a little child. Do you understand what I'm saying? You know, it's like I have a sense of superiority, and this inferior person behind the counter needs to be spoken to as if she were a little child. Now, I don't know that's what was going through her brain, but I think it probably was. Now, the reason I say that is we need to speak clearly and distinctly, but we need to understand when we do that, when we practice our speech patterns, that some people are going to take offense. I'm sorry that they take offense, and I may try to work on my modulating and speak clearly and distinctly, but not so much so that they find it annoying. But still, if they're going to be offended, they're going to be offended. Let's talk about voice weakness. This is a problem that I have and I discover as I interact with other people with Asperger's syndrome. Many of them face the same problem. That is, we have a weak voice. We have weak voices. We cannot project as loudly and as clearly and with a pleasant voice as typical people. And there is a reason, I believe. I believe that reason is because you got to practice. You got to use your muscles. If you don't use your muscles, you're going to lose your muscles. Now, not entirely, but partially. It's like any other muscle. If you work it out, it gets stronger. It becomes more effective in its use. If you lift weights, your muscles are supposed to get bigger, and so you can then lift even bigger weights. Same thing is true as the components of your vocal system. They've got to be exercised to reach their maximum potential. Now, well, let's talk about this, but then we're going to talk about the importance of being able to make noise. Believe it or not, there are people out there who become multi-millionaires just by making noise. I'll talk about that in just a second. So let's talk about voice weakness. There are 3 biological subsystems that allow us to speak, allow you to speak. And all 3 require regular exercise because they work together in harmony. These systems are, number 1, first is your air pressure system. Where does the air come from when you speak? Well, it comes from your lungs, obviously. So your air pressure system utilizes your diaphragm, your chest muscles, your ribs, abdominal muscles, and your lungs, as we mentioned earlier. These organs provide and regulate air pressure that causes the vocal cords to vibrate. So even as I am speaking, what I am doing is I'm using the air that's in my lungs to make my vocal cords vibrate. You are hearing my vibrations. Speaking of vibrations, do you remember a song that was popular back in the 1960s? In fact, my opinion, but in fact, I believe it was the greatest song ever recorded. It was called Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys. Remember that. We're going to talk about that again in just a moment. Second is your vibratory system. It utilizes your larynx, otherwise known as your voice box, and vocal cords, otherwise known, or vocal folds, otherwise known as your vocal cords. Vocal folds vibrate. I'm doing it again. I'm tripping. The vibration converts air pressure to sound waves, which is what your listeners hear when you speak. We just said that. Number 3 is this: your resonating system. The vocal tract includes your nasal cavity, your nose, your oral cavity, your mouth, and your pharynx. Well, what is your pharynx? Your pharynx is a membrane-lined cavity positioned behind your nose and mouth. It connects these to your esophagus. Your pharynx in the vernacular is your throat. Well, why don't you just say your throat? Well, I guess we could, but technically it is your pharynx. So all 3 of these systems work together in harmony for optimal use. Typical people exercise these systems regularly as they socialize. But what if you are reticent to socialize? What if you have that phobic component of your personality that causes you to be withdrawn? So you don't socialize, therefore you don't use these systems. Well, what happens is that's a lack of exercise, and it becomes cyclical. We will talk about that in just a moment. But did you know, speaking of good vibrations, that some people make countless millions of dollars just making noise? What do you do for a living? They would say, well, we're noisemakers. Actually, they would not say they're noisemakers. They would say they are musicians. They would say we are singers. We're professional entertainers. We make noise for a living. What does that have to do with good vibrations? I have no idea how much money the Beach Boys made from that recording, but my guess is it was a ton of money. I probably could retire on what they earned from that one song. What was Good Vibrations? It was a song. It was people making a living by making noise with their voices and with their instruments. Now, I have heard other artists sing that song, perform that song. Wilson Phillips, good example. A cappella, without instruments. Absolutely beautiful. And by the way, there's another example of people who make a very good living making noise. What do they do for a living? They're noisemakers. That doesn't sound good, does it? So we will call them entertainers or musicians, but that is what they do. Now, the reason we bring that up is to underscore the importance of your voice. It's not just professional singers that make a living making noise, but salespeople have to make noise with their voice to make sales, with very few exceptions. Now, I was in direct marketing, and I didn't have to use my voice nearly as much as a one-on-one sales rep would, say a car salesman. Still, I had to communicate with my voice. I had to make noise when I talked to vendors. I had to make noise when I talked to customers. On the phone, never face-to-face, which is one of the nice things about the direct mail business, is you are not forced to be in that social environment. In fact, during the 30-some years I was in business before I retired, I can recall one time, and I had thousands of customers, but I can remember one time when I actually met a customer one-on-one. I don't know why, but for some reason this customer came to my office. Customers never came to my office. Most of them lived out of state. You know, it just wasn't convenient to stop by. But for some reason, whatever, this guy came by. And so we had a nice conversation. But the point being is, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you do. Making noise with your vocal system is an essential component of a livelihood. All of us, at least in part, make noise for a living. The only exceptions that I can think of are people who absolutely, positively cannot speak. And it presents a serious problem for them, usually. That brings us to the cycle. And this is really simple. Because Aspergians find conversations cumbersome, they tend to shy away from social interaction. Avoiding social interaction exasperates conversation skills. Each inflames the other. Conversation difficulties deter social interaction. Social interaction difficulties deter conversation skills. So I call this the cycle. Why do we have such weak voices? Because we don't use them. Why do we not use them? Because we can't. Because we don't like to socialize. Because it is sometimes painful to do it. So we have a cycle. We don't talk because we don't want to. We don't want to because we don't talk well. So what to do? Let's wind up with this. What we have to do, as we mentioned earlier, is we need to exercise our vocal cords, our vocal system. How do you do that? Well, one of the little tricks that I use, one of my life hacks, is I make videos. I'm sitting here talking to nobody. I've got this little contraption in front of me called a camera, and I'm talking to the camera. I'm much more comfortable talking to this contraption than I would be talking to a person. Some experts, and I've mentioned this before, but some experts say, think of your video camera as a person, and you're talking to that person. That is the worst advice for me. For most people, typical people, it's great advice. I do just the opposite. When I talk to individuals, I think of them as cameras. I'm just talking to a video camera. But the point is, you need to practice. Now, there are many good videos on YouTube you can go to. Speech coaches. Watch those videos. Selectively, try to select those who actually know what they're talking about. And then there is always the option that you can hire a speech coach. But even then, it is absolutely positively necessary that you find a way to practice. One of the best ways to practice, in my opinion, is get in your car, drive down the road all alone, roll up your windows, turn on the heat, air conditioner, whatever, and sing along with the Beach Boys.